Hello, dear dreamers, and welcome back to another evening by the hearth. I'm James, and tonight as the autumn winds whistle through the trees and the first frost kisses the ground, I thought we might journey together to the lonely mountain, where shadows of dragons once fell across halls of gold and the hammers of dwarven smiths rang like thunder in the deep places of the world. Tonight's tale is one of greed and consequence, of courage found in the most unlikely of hearts, and of how even the smallest person can change the course of the future. We'll explore the rise and fall of the greatest dwarvish kingdom, the coming of the dragon from the north, and the extraordinary quest that would restore a king to his throne and awaken powers that had slumbered for ages. This is a story that spans generations, from the forging of ancient alliances to the clash of 5 armies beneath a mountain's shadow. It's about the weight of gold, the price of pride, and the courage that can bloom even in the darkest of times. I remember the first time I heard this tale as a child, how it made me believe that adventure could find anyone, anywhere, and that heroes come in all shapes and sizes. So draw your chair closer to the fire, dear friends. Perhaps you have a warm drink at hand, something to ward off the chill that seems to follow tales of dragons and deep places. Let the dancing flames cast their golden light as we speak of gold itself, how it gleams, how it calls, and how it can both destroy and redeem. Close your eyes if you wish and let your mind wander back to the great days of old, when the world was wider and stranger than it is now. Picture yourself standing in a comfortable hobbit hole, round door painted green, brass knocker gleaming in the morning sun. You can smell breakfast cooking, eggs, bacon, seed cake fresh from the oven. The pantry is full, the garden is blooming, and all seems right with the world. But then comes an unexpected knock at the door, and with it, the echo of distant mountains calling. Feel that moment when adventure reaches out its hand, the mixture of fear and excitement, the pull of unknown paths and untold stories. For it is in such moments that the greatest tales begin, when ordinary folk are called to do extraordinary things. Now let your mind's eye soar beyond the comfortable lands, up and over the great river, past the dark line of Mirkwood, to where the lonely mountain stands against the sky like a monument to lost glory. In your imagination, walk with me through the ruins of Dale. Feel the weight of years and abandonment in its empty streets. Listen to the wind howling through broken windows, and know that somewhere above, in halls carved from living stone, a dragon sleeps on a bed of gold. This is where our journey will take us, from the green fields of the Shire to the desolate wasteland of the dragon, and back again. But the path between comfort and glory is long and winding, filled with trolls and goblins, riddles in the dark, and the ever-present possibility that those who set out may never return home again. Let us begin, then, with the forging of a kingdom and the crafting of a doom that none could foresee. The Forge of Kings. In the deep places of the world, where the roots of mountains touch the bones of the earth itself, there once rang the hammers of the greatest smiths who ever lived. This was in the elder days, when the kingdoms of the dwarves stretched from the gray mountains to the iron hills, and their skill with metal and stone was the wonder of all Middle-earth. The dwarves were an ancient people even then, born of the stone itself in the depths of time, crafted by Aule the smith among the Valar to be his companions in the great work of shaping the world. They were made to be sturdy and enduring, resistant to fire and darkness, with hearts as strong as the metal they worked, and wills as unyielding as the mountain peaks they called home. Among all their kingdoms, none was greater than Khazad-dûm, the Dwarodelf, which men in their tongue called Moria. There, in halls that stretched for miles beneath the misty mountains, the dwarves delved deep and greedily, following veins of precious metal and the most treasured of all their finds, mithril, the true silver that was worth more than gold. But our tale concerns a different mountain, one that would rise to rival even the greatness of Khazad-dûm. Far to the north and east, where the gray mountains touched the sky, and the winds carried the bite of eternal winter, there stood a peak that sang with promise to the ears of those who understood the language of stone. This mountain, which would come to be called Erebor, the Lonely Mountain, first drew the attention of the dwarves in the days when their kingdoms were young, and their people were still exploring the furthest reaches of their realm. A small band of miners, following rumors of rich deposits, made the long journey from their established halls to investigate this distant peak. What they found there exceeded their wildest dreams. The mountain was rich beyond measure, not just in gold and silver, but in precious gems that caught the light like captured stars. The stone itself was perfect for carving, strong enough to support vast halls, yet beautiful enough to grace a king's throne room. Springs of sweet water bubbled up from deep places, and the air itself seemed to sing with potential. Word spread quickly through the dwarvish kingdoms of this discovery, and soon the greatest miners, carvers, and smiths began making the journey to Erebor. They came not as conquerors, but as craftsmen, drawn by the promise of creating something magnificent, something that would stand as a testament to their skill for all the ages of the world. The work began slowly, carefully. The dwarves were never hasty in their great undertakings, preferring to plan each hall, each passage, each carved detail with the patience of ages. The first halls they carved were modest affairs, workshop spaces where they could begin the delicate work of understanding the mountain's nature, learning the grain of its stone and the flow of its hidden waters. But as the years passed and became decades, and the decades stretched into centuries, the scope of their vision grew. What had begun as a mining operation became something far grander, the construction of a kingdom that would rival any in Middle-earth, a place where dwarvish civilization could reach its highest expression. The great halls of Erebor were carved with such skill that they seemed to have grown naturally from the living rock. Pillars rose like trees in a stone forest, their surfaces covered with intricate carvings that told the history of the dwarvish people. The ceilings soared overhead, supported by arches that seemed to defy the very weight of the mountain above. Rivers of gold were channeled through the halls, not merely as decoration, but as part of the mountain's very architecture. The precious metal was woven into the stone itself, creating patterns of light and shadow that changed with the movement of the sun across the sky outside. In certain halls, at certain times of day, the very walls seemed to glow with an inner fire that was beautiful beyond description. At the heart of it all, they carved the throne room of what would become the kingdom under the mountain. This was a vast space, its dimensions carefully calculated to inspire both awe and reverence. The throne itself was carved from a single massive piece of white stone, inlaid with gold and precious gems in patterns that had been passed down through generations of dwarvish kings. But perhaps the greatest achievement of all was the forging of the Arkenstone, the heart of the mountain. This was no mere jewel, though it blazed with an inner light that put all other gems to shame. It was a symbol, a focal point for all the skill and devotion that the dwarves had poured into their mountain home. To look upon the Arkenstone was to see the very soul of Erebor made manifest, a crystallization of centuries of hope and labor. As the kingdom grew, so too did its reputation. Word spread throughout Middle-earth of the wonders that lay beneath the lonely mountain. And soon, traders and diplomats began making the long journey to see these marvels for themselves. The dwarves, proud of their achievement, welcomed these visitors and began to establish trade relationships that would enrich both Erebor and the lands around it. The men who lived in the area, scattered tribes who had long struggled to scratch a living from the harsh northern lands, found their fortunes transformed by proximity to the dwarvish kingdom. They established the city of Dale at the mountain's feet, positioning themselves to serve as intermediaries between the dwarves and the wider world of men. Dale grew rapidly, its population swelling with merchants, craftsmen, and others drawn by the opportunity for prosperity. The city became a marvel in its own right, with wide streets and tall buildings, markets that overflowed with goods from every corner of Middle-earth, and a population that was among the most cosmopolitan anywhere. To the south, where the river that flowed from the Lonely Mountain eventually reached Long Lake, the lakemen established their own trading posts and eventually a thriving town built on stilts over the water itself. Lake Town, as it came to be called, served as the final link in the chain that connected Erebor to the great ports of the southern kingdoms. For many generations, this arrangement brought prosperity to all involved. The dwarves delved ever deeper into their mountain, discovering new treasures and creating ever more magnificent works of art. The men of Dale and Lake Town grew wealthy from the trade that flowed through their hands. Even the elves of the woodland realm, normally aloof from the affairs of other races, found themselves drawn into this network of mutual benefit. But in all this prosperity, in all this celebration of achievement and accumulation of wealth, there were subtle changes taking place in the halls of Erebor. The dwarves, so proud of their accomplishments, began to grow possessive of their treasures. What had once been created for the joy of creation began to be hoarded for the pleasure of possession. The kings of Erebor, seated on their throne of white stone with the Arkenstone blazing overhead, found their thoughts turning ever inward, ever downward, to the treasure halls beneath their feet. Visitors, once welcomed as friends and partners, began to be seen as potential threats. What did they really want? What might they take if given the chance? This growing insularity did not go entirely unnoticed. In the halls of the elves, there were whispers of concern about their dwarvish neighbors. The men of Dale, though still prosperous from their trade relationships, began to sense a cooling in the warmth with which they were received in the mountain halls. But these subtle changes seemed small indeed compared to the obvious prosperity that continued to flow from the kingdom under the mountain. The treasure halls of Erebor continued to fill with gold and jewels, the workshops continued to produce marvels of craftsmanship, and the great hall continued to ring with the sound of celebration and feasting. None suspected that far to the north, in the waste places where dragons were said to dwell, ancient eyes had begun to take notice of the growing horde beneath the lonely mountain. For dragons, as all wise folk know, can sense gold across vast distances, and the accumulation of so much wealth in one place had begun to sing to them like a siren song heard in dreams. In the gray mountains, where winter never truly ends and the peaks are shrouded in eternal mist, something vast and terrible began to stir from slumber that had lasted for centuries. Smaug the Mighty, last of the great fire drakes of the north, felt the pull of distant gold tugging at his consciousness, like a hook set deep in his heart. For dragons are creatures of greed made manifest, beings whose very nature compels them to seek out and claim treasure wherever it may be found. They cannot resist the call of gold any more than a river can resist flowing downhill, and the greater the hoard, the stronger the compulsion becomes. As the treasure of Erebor continued to grow, so too did its pull on the sleeping dragon. Day by day, season by season, the call grew stronger, filtering into Smaug's dreams and turning them toward visions of gold and jewels, and all the wealth that lay beneath the distant mountain. The time was coming when the dragon would be able to resist no longer, when he would spread his vast wings and take flight, following the golden scent that pulled him southward toward a destiny that would reshape the north of Middle-earth forever. But that awakening, when it came, would bring with it fire and death and the end of everything that the dwarves had spent centuries building. The kingdom under the mountain stood at the height of its glory, shining like a beacon of civilization in the northern wilderness. Its halls were full of laughter and the ring of hammers. Its treasure vaults overflowed with wealth beyond counting, and its future seemed as bright as the Arkenstone itself. But in the gray mountains, the dragon was beginning to wake. The first stirrings of Smaug's awakening were felt not in the gray mountains where he lay, but in the very dreams of sensitive folk scattered across the northern lands. Elves, with their deep connection to the unseen world, woke from sleep troubled by visions they could not quite remember. Wise men among the race of men found themselves gazing northward with unexplained unease. Even the dwarves of Erebor, deep in their mountain halls, began to report strange dreams of fire and shadow. But these were subtle signs, easily dismissed by those too busy with daily concerns to pay attention to omens and portents. The kingdom under the mountain continued its prosperous existence. The forges continued to burn bright, and the treasure halls continued to fill with wealth from across Middle-earth. Smaug himself was not yet fully conscious of what was calling to him. For dragons, awakening from the deep sleep of centuries is not a sudden thing, but a gradual process that can take years to complete. At first there were only dreams, visions of gold glittering in firelight, of vast halls filled with treasure, of wealth beyond even a dragon's vast capacity for avarice. These dreams began to intrude more and more frequently into the dragon's slumber. Where once he had slept peacefully for decades without stirring, now he began to shift restlessly in his lair, his great claws scraping against stone, his massive form creating minor earthquakes that shook the gray mountains and sent avalanches cascading down their slopes. The creatures that lived in those desolate peaks, the few hardy birds and beasts that could survive in such a harsh environment, began to flee southward, driven by an instinct older than thought. They could sense the growing danger, the building malevolence that would soon explode into wakefulness and rage. As months turned to years, Smaug's periods of wakefulness grew longer and more frequent. He began to explore his ancient lair, stretching muscles that had been still for centuries, testing the strength of claws and wings that had not been used for longer than the memory of most living things. The dragon's lair was itself a testament to his ancient power and malevolence. Carved from the living rock of the gray mountains, it was a vast cavern system that stretched for miles beneath the peaks. The walls were blackened by centuries of dragon fire, and the floors were littered with the bones of creatures that had been unfortunate enough to disturb his slumber over the ages. In the deepest chamber of his lair, Smaug had accumulated his own hoard, a collection of treasure gathered during his earlier periods of activity, before the long sleep had claimed him. But compared to the wealth that was calling to him from the south, his current hoard seemed paltry, almost insulting in its inadequacy. For dragons measure their worth not just by the size of their hoards, but by their quality and magnificence. A dragon with a small collection of common gold and simple gems is a poor dragon indeed, while one who possesses unique treasures and works of surpassing beauty is wealthy beyond measure. The reports that filtered north to Smaug's slowly awakening consciousness spoke of treasure that surpassed anything he had ever imagined. Not just gold and silver, though there was said to be enough of those to fill entire halls, but works of craftsmanship that were the wonder of the age. Armor that shone like captured starlight, weapons whose edges would never dull, cups and crowns and jewelry that blazed with inner fire. And above all, there were whispers of the Arkenstone, the heart of the mountain, a gem so magnificent that it was said to outshine all other jewels as the sun outshines the stars. For a dragon, the thought of such a treasure was almost unbearable. a desire so intense that it became a physical pain, gnawing at his consciousness like hunger that could never be satisfied. As his awareness grew, so too did Smaug's anger at being so long deprived of such wealth. How dare these dwarves accumulate such treasure while he lay sleeping? By what right did they keep such magnificence from him, when he was clearly the only being in Middle-earth capable of truly appreciating its worth? Dragons are creatures of pride as much as greed, and Smaug was perhaps the proudest of all his kind. In his mind, the very existence of the treasure hoard at Erebor was an insult to his majesty, a challenge that demanded an immediate and overwhelming response. The dragon began to make preparations for what he saw not as theft, but as the rightful reclaiming of treasure that belonged to him by natural law. He tested his wings, stretching them to their full span and beating the air until the resulting winds howled through the gray mountains like the voices of the damned. He breathed fire, great gouts of flame that lit up the mountain peaks like beacons and could be seen for miles in every direction. These displays did not go entirely unnoticed. The few hardy folk who lived in the northern reaches began to report strange lights in the gray mountains, accompanied by sounds like thunder that seemed to come from beneath the earth itself. But these reports were dismissed by most as the tales of simple folk prone to superstition and exaggeration. Only among the wisest of the elves was there a growing sense of unease, a feeling that something ancient and terrible was stirring in the north. But even they could not have imagined the full scope of the disaster that was approaching, or the speed with which it would descend upon the unsuspecting kingdom of Erebor. For Smaug's preparations were nearly complete. His strength had returned. His fires burned hotter than they had in centuries, and his desire for the treasure of the lonely mountain had grown from a whisper to a roar that filled his entire being. Soon, very soon, he would spread his wings and take to the sky, following the golden scent that called to him across the hundreds of miles that separated his lair from his prize. The kingdom under the mountain continued its daily existence, unaware that its doom was taking wing in the gray wastes of the north. The forges burned bright, the markets of Dale bustled with activity, and the treasure halls continued to fill with wealth from across Middle-earth. But in the gray mountains, the last of the great dragons prepared for war. The day that Smaug came to Erebor dawned clear and bright, with autumn sunlight painting the peak of the lonely mountain in shades of gold that seemed prophetic of the fire that was to come. The guards upon the mountain's great gates went about their duties with no sense of the catastrophe approaching from the north. The forges rang with their usual rhythm. The merchants of Dale prepared their wares for another day of profitable trading, and the kingdom under the mountain hummed with the comfortable business of everyday life. The first sign that something was amiss came from the birds. Ravens, those ancient friends of the dwarves who had long served as messengers and scouts, began arriving at the mountain in unusual numbers. They flew in from the north with their feathers singed and their cries filled with unmistakable terror. But even these warnings were not immediately understood for what they were: harbingers of the greatest disaster to befall the dwarvish people since the fall of Khazad-dûm. It was a young guardsman on the northern watchtower who first spotted the approaching shadow. At first he took it for a distant storm cloud, dark and ominous against the clear sky. But as it drew closer, the terrible truth became apparent. This was no natural phenomenon, but something far worse. A dragon in flight, his massive wings beating the air as he followed the scent of gold that had called to him across the empty leagues. Smaug was magnificent in his horror. A creature from the elder days when dragons ruled the skies and the greatest works of civilization burned at their whim. His scales were like molten gold layered over iron, each one as large as a warrior's shield, overlapping in perfect patterns that turned aside all mortal weapons. His eyes burned like furnaces in the caverns of his skull, twin points of malevolent intelligence that seemed to see into the very hearts of those who looked upon him. When the dragon opened his mouth, Fire poured forth like a river of liquid sun, so hot that it turned stone to glass and metal to vapor. His roar was like the sound of mountains falling, a noise so profound that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the world. And his size. Never had the people of Erebor imagined that any living creature could be so vast, his wingspan casting shadows that darkened entire valleys, his length stretching like that of a great ship sailing through the air. The alarm bells of Erebor began to ring as the guards finally understood what they were seeing. The great gates of the mountain, massive portals of stone and metal that had taken decades to carve and hang, began to swing shut as the dwarves prepared for siege. But what preparation could avail against such a foe? Smaug's first pass over the mountain was a reconnaissance, a chance for the dragon to survey his prize and plan his assault. He circled the peak like a hunting bird, his keen eyes taking in every detail of the kingdom's defenses, every possible escape route, every weakness that might be exploited. The dwarves who had rushed to the battlements and watchtowers found themselves paralyzed by the sight of their approaching doom. Here was a creature from the darkest legends of their people, a being of such malevolent power that even their ancestors, who had faced the Balrogs in the depths of Moria, had spoken of dragons with special fear. But the dwarves were not a people to surrender without a fight. As Smaug wheeled overhead, preparing for his attack, the warriors of Erebor readied their weapons and prepared to defend their home with their lives. Crossbows were loaded with bolts tipped with their finest steel. Catapults were charged with stones designed to bring down even the greatest foes. And the smiths worked frantically to prepare whatever weapons might have a chance of piercing dragonhide. When Smaug finally descended to begin his assault, the dwarves met him with everything they had. Bolts filled the air like a steel rain, and stones crashed against the dragon's flanks with sounds like thunder. But their weapons, for all their fine craftsmanship and the skill of those who wielded them, were like toys hurled against a mountain. The dragon's scales turned aside their strongest steel, and his hide was proof against any force they could bring to bear. The dragon's response was swift and merciless. Fire poured from his jaws in torrents, washing over the mountain's defenses like a tide of destruction. The great gates, those mighty barriers that had seemed strong enough to withstand any siege, began to glow red-hot under the assault of dragonfire. Metal flowed like water, stone cracked and crumbled, and the very air itself seemed to burn with the heat of Smaug's breath. The outer defenses fell in minutes. Watchtowers that had stood for centuries were reduced to molten ruins. The courtyards and terraces that had been carved with such care from the living rock became furnaces that no living thing could endure. And still the dragon's fire poured down, seeking every crevice, every hiding place, every refuge where his enemies might think to shelter. Those defenders who could retreat did so, falling back through passages that were rapidly becoming death traps as the heat of the dragon's breath followed them into the mountain itself. The wounded were left behind, not from cruelty, but from necessity. In the face of such overwhelming destruction, it was all that anyone could do to preserve their own lives. The civilian population of Erebor faced a choice that no people should ever have to make. Stay and face certain death, or flee and abandon everything they had built over generations of patient labor. Most chose flight, but even that decision came with its own terrible costs. The mountain's halls, designed to be defensible, had only a few exits, and these quickly became choked with desperate refugees trying to escape the advancing fires. Families were separated in the chaos, parents losing children in the press of terrified crowds. Ancient treasures that had been passed down through generations, abandoned in the desperate scramble to reach safety. The careful order and prosperity that had taken centuries to build dissolved in a matter of hours into pure chaos and terror. King Thror, he who had ruled Erebor in its greatest days of prosperity, found himself faced with the collapse of everything he had worked to build. From the window of his throne room, he could see the dragon wreaking havoc on his kingdom, turning centuries of careful work into molten ruin with casual ease. The Arkenstone, the heart of the mountain that had blazed so proudly above the throne, seemed now to mock him with its beauty. What good was the finest jewel in all Middle-earth when the mountain that housed it was being consumed by dragonfire? What value did all their accumulated wealth have when death flew overhead on wings of shadow and flame? But even in those final moments, the king's thoughts turned not to his own safety, but to his people. If he could buy them time to escape, if his sacrifice could save even a few of the refugees who were still struggling to reach the mountain's exits, then perhaps some remnant of their civilization could survive this catastrophe. The king's final stand was brief but magnificent in its hopelessness. Wielding ancient weapons that had been forged in the earliest days of the kingdom, surrounded by his most loyal guards, he met the dragon in the very heart of his mountain home. The battle lasted only minutes. What could mortal steel do against a creature whose very breath was death? But those minutes bought precious time for the refugees still fleeing through the mountain's passages. As the great hall of Erebor filled with fire and smoke, as the throne of white stone began to crack and crumble under the heat, as the carefully carved pillars started to bow and break, the last king of the mountain fell, defending the home he had loved more than life itself.
But his sacrifice was not entirely in vain.
The delay he had bought allowed many of his people to escape through the secret passages that led to the lower slopes of the mountain. These refugees, carrying nothing but their lives and the bitter knowledge of their loss, scattered into the wilderness as their ancient home burned behind them. Smaug, having crushed all resistance, settled into the treasure halls of Erebor like a cat claiming a sunbeam. The accumulated wealth of centuries lay spread before him, gold and silver beyond counting, gems that blazed with inner fire, works of art whose beauty transcended their material worth. And above all, the Arkenstone itself, the heart of the mountain, whose radiance filled even the dragon's cold heart with satisfaction. The dragon arranged his new hoard with the meticulous care of a creature whose every instinct was focused on the acquisition and protection of treasure. Gold was sorted by purity, gems were arranged by size and brilliance, and the finest works of craftsmanship were positioned where they could be most easily admired. This was not mere greed, but an aesthetic appreciation that was perhaps the most refined aspect of the dragon's otherwise malevolent nature. When his sorting was complete, Smaug coiled his great body around his new hoard and settled into the deep sleep of the satisfied predator. The mountain, which had rung for centuries with the sounds of industry and celebration, fell silent except for the occasional rumble of the dragon's breathing. Outside, the lands around Erebor bore the scars of the dragon's coming. Dale, the great city that had flourished at the mountain's feet, lay in ruins. Those citizens who had not fled in time had perished in the fires that swept down from the peak, and those who had escaped carried with them nothing but the clothes on their backs, and memories of prosperity turned to ash. Laketown, protected by distance and the waters of the long lake, had survived the initial assault. But with Dale destroyed and Erebor fallen, the town's prosperity withered like a plant cut off from its roots. The great trade networks that had enriched the north collapsed overnight, leaving the lakemen to struggle for survival in isolation. The survivors of the disaster scattered to the four winds. Some sought refuge with distant relatives in other dwarvish settlements, carrying with them the tale of their kingdom's fall. Others wandered the wild lands as exiles, never finding another place they could truly call home. A few, the hardiest and most determined, began even then to dream of return, to plan for the day when the dragon might be defeated and their mountain home reclaimed. But for now, Smaug reigned supreme in the halls of Erebor. The kingdom under the mountain had become the dragon's desolation, a place where no living thing dared to venture. The great dragon lay coiled around his stolen hoard, dreaming whatever dreams dragons dream, while around him the empty halls echoed with the memory of all that had been lost. Years passed, then decades. The dragon slept, and the mountain remained silent. But in the wider world, the tale of Erebor's fall was not forgotten. Bards sang of the kingdom's glory and its tragic end, keeping alive the memory of what had been destroyed. And in the hearts of the scattered dwarvish people, hope remained alive. The hope that someday, somehow, their ancient home would be restored to them. For dragons, mighty as they are not immortal. And even the greatest hoard is worthless if there is no one left who remembers its true value. The wheel of fate, which had brought such catastrophe to the north, would in time turn again, bringing with it possibilities that not even the wisest could foresee. In the aftermath of Smaug's conquest, the survivors of Erebor found themselves scattered across Middle-earth, like seeds carried by a bitter wind. Some sought refuge in the ancient dwarvish strongholds of the Iron Hills, where their kinfolk welcomed them with what comfort they could provide. Others made their way to the Blue Mountains in the far west, joining the communities of dwarves who had never known the glory of the kingdom under the mountain, but understood all too well the pain of exile and loss. But for many of the refugees, no existing settlement could ease the ache of homelessness that had settled into their bones. They became wanderers, moving from place to place in search of work, purpose, or simply a reason to continue living in a world that had been forever changed by fire and shadow. Among these wanderers was Prince Thrain, son of the fallen King Thror, who had escaped the destruction of Erebor with nothing but his life and the heavy burden of kingship thrust upon him by tragedy. Unlike many of his people, who sought to find new homes and rebuild their lives elsewhere, Thrain could never accept that their mountain kingdom was truly lost. The weight of the crown that had passed to him in the moment of his father's death was not just ceremonial. It represented the hopes and dreams of an entire people, and he could not set it aside while their ancient home remained in the claws of the dragon. For decades, Thrain wandered the paths of Middle-earth, gathering information about Smaug, seeking allies who might aid in the mountain's reclamation, and keeping alive the hope of return among those dwarves who would listen to his words. But dragons are long-lived creatures, and Smaug showed no signs of weakness or decline. If anything, the reports that filtered back to the dwarvish communities suggested that the dragon had grown even more terrible in the years since his conquest, his power fed by the magical properties of the treasure he guarded. The other peoples of Middle-earth, while sympathetic to the dwarves' plight, were reluctant to involve themselves in a conflict with a dragon. The elven king of the woodland realm, though he had once traded profitably with Erebor, had his own people to think of, and no desire to provoke Smaug's wrath. The men of the various kingdoms remembered all too well what dragonfire could do to cities and armies, and few were willing to risk their own people's safety for the sake of dwarvish ambitions. As the years passed, this lack of support began to take its toll on Thrain's spirit. The burden of leadership, carried without the resources or secure kingdom that had once supported it, grew heavier with each passing season. The king began to speak of desperate measures, of seeking aid from sources that more cautious folk would hesitate to approach. It was during this period of growing desperation that Thrain began to be troubled by strange dreams and visions. He spoke of voices calling to him in the night, of promises of power sufficient to reclaim his kingdom, of ancient alliances that could be renewed if only he had the courage to seek them out. His son Thorin, who had grown from a young prince into a warrior in the years of exile, watched his father's descent into obsession with growing alarm. The final tragedy of Thrain's story came when he announced his intention to journey into the wild lands of the East, following visions that he claimed would lead him to the aid he sought. Despite the pleas of his son and the warnings of his counselors, the exiled king set out with a small company of his most loyal followers, disappearing into the wilderness in pursuit of hopes that proved to be as insubstantial as smoke. Thorin waited for word of his father's expedition for years, but no message ever came. Eventually, rumors reached the dwarvish communities of strange lights seen in the eastern mountains, of battles fought against shadowy enemies, of voices crying out in the night. But whether these tales had any connection to Thrain's fate, none could say for certain. With his father's disappearance, the burden of leadership fell upon Thorin's shoulders. Unlike Thrain, who had ruled a kingdom in its glory before losing it to the dragon, Thorin had never known Erebor except as a memory and a dream. His people were scattered exiles, his treasury was empty, and his kingdom consisted of nothing more than the stories told around campfires by old dwarves who remembered better days. But perhaps because he had never known the weight of established power, Thorin proved to be a different kind of leader than his predecessors. Where they had ruled from throne rooms carved in living stone, he led from the front lines of whatever work his people could find. Where they had commanded armies and dispensed justice from positions of unquestioned authority, he earned respect through shared hardship and personal example. Under Thorin's leadership, the scattered dwarves began to organize themselves into something resembling a people once again. They established networks of communication that stretched across Middle-earth, keeping alive the bonds of kinship and shared culture that might otherwise have been lost in the years of exile. They formed companies of craftsmen and traders, using their traditional skills to earn their place in the economies of their host communities. Most importantly, they kept alive the memory of Erebor itself. In their songs and stories, in the lessons they taught,